We're happy to welcome you tonight to our Bible class. We're looking at the book of the Covenant. We are in chapter 22 of the book of Exodus. On your outline, we were on G, number 4, where we began tonight. G4. I'm not calling out bingo numbers. But I want to take time especially to deal with this because of the emphasis in the Old Testament on the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan, and the place that God gives to them. Let's go to Leviticus 19. Verse 9, Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, Jehovah your God. All right? Do not glean. Now that means don't get everything in it. Which, if I were living in that day, would be totally against everything I think. I think y'all pick it clean and you're going to pick it. But there was a reason for this. Poor people, a sojourner, do not own land very likely. And they can glean behind you and live. So notice you plant and you harvest with somebody else in mind. I do not know this. I could not prove it. But I wonder if that might figure into Luke chapter 12 when Jesus dealt with the farmer who tore down his barns to build bigger rather than thinking about somebody else. And Jehovah said, you foolish one, tonight is your soul required of you, then whose will all these things be that you've laid up? But here's the idea of taking care of them. Now you have the same idea presented to the second generation in Deuteronomy 14. Deuteronomy 14, 28. And this has to do with the tithe. Deuteronomy 14, 28. At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. Now notice, there would be storehouses. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow within your gates, may come and eat, now if you mark in your Bible, and be satisfied. That Jehovah your God, in order that Jehovah your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. We serve a God who gives leftovers. God never gave people a snack. These people are to be able to eat until they are satisfied. Now, the two accounts in the New Testament of Jesus feeding 5,000 and 4,000, those people ate till they were full and took up leftovers. In the book of Malachi, Jehovah said, if you're faithful to me, you can open up the windows of your storehouses and I'll fill your storehouses and they'll flow out of the windows. God who gives leftovers. So here is providing for others, not just a snack, but satisfaction. Be sure they have enough. So God said, this is what you are to do. Now you turn over 2 chapters to Deuteronomy 16, beginning in verse 9. This is the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you began to put the sickle to the grain. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to Jehovah your God, with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as Jehovah your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before Jehovah your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place where Jehovah your God chooses to make his name abide. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days, when you have gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress. And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite, the stranger, and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. Now notice this continual inclusion of the stranger. That's a Gentile. And yet here's amenability and his being prospered by the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Pentecost. So there was an outreach through these feasts. These people were to be thinking not only of themselves, but of other people. Now, when you get to James 1, James talks about what pure religion is, as far as God is concerned. There are 2 ways of looking at pure religion. Number 1, man's viewpoint. Number 2, God's viewpoint. And they generally are not the same. Here's God's viewpoint. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this. Now we have the word visit. Everybody have visit there? That entails more than our word. What do we generally think about when we see the word visit?
Go by and see how they're doing.
Go by. Go see somebody. Well, that's the first part of what this word would entail. You can't do what this word entails unless you go. You're going to have to go where people are. But the word visit here means take care of their needs. It's the same word Jesus used in Matthew 25 when he said, I was sick and in prison and you visited me. You took care of my needs. So it's not just going to see somebody, but it's going to see someone with the intent of meeting needs, taking care of needs. So you take care of, is what he's saying, orphans and widows in their trouble. The old King James, in their affliction. So you take care of. Indication is, widows and orphans are likely to find themselves in trouble. And that just makes sense. They've lost or don't have the people who normally or at one time took care of. So we are to be more attuned to that. And it might be better for all of us in the church if we talk to our widows more often, and talk to, if we have orphans, more often, and see if there are needs that need to be met. And often, there are needs that need to be met, but they won't tell you. And that's where going to see them sometimes comes to bear. You know, if they won't tell you their house is falling in, but you go down there and you see it falling in, you might get the idea they need some help. Some of you may have seen in church bulletins the Theophilus cartoon. One of the cartoons showed a woman sick and in bed, and two church members, two women sitting there who had come to visit her, and they were just gabbing away, and clothes were piled up, needed washing, dishes were running over out of the sink, and they're shown sitting there talking, and finally, as they're going out the door, they say, if you need anything, let us know. That's us. Too many times. So I want you to notice the background for James 1:27 is the book of the covenant. And here is the principle that was planted in the Old Testament. The same principle is brought under the New Covenant. Different way of doing it. Doesn't have to do with gleaning under the New Covenant. It has to do with whatever their needs are. Because under the New Covenant, you would not have as much of an agricultural society as you would have in the land of Canaan under the Old Covenant. Because it had expanded into the world. Christianity would go into the known world. And you had some metropolitan places that would be industrial. All was a tent making, industry. You had the guilds, the work guilds, of which Alexander the coppersmith very likely was a leader in the copper guild in Ephesus. So you would have these things that would play. So you take care of. Now, when you look at these classes, he basically names four. The Levite was to be taken care of mainly by their offerings. The Levites got a certain portion of the offerings, and by their tithes. That was to go to support the Levite. So they were to be taken care of. See, they didn't get a land grant. They only had suburbs outside the city, so they would be very limited in their ability to provide for themselves. Then you take care of the widow. So here's someone who's been left. Partner has now gone. Now, implied in that would be the widower if it were applicable to him. So you deal with men that lose their support. And some of them need help. So you don't just automatically exclude them. Then you have the orphan, the fatherless. That ought to be self-evident. There's a child who needs to be cared for. And then you have the sojourner, a stranger, who is not a resident of Palestine or of Judea or Israel. He's taken up temporary arrangement there, but he's living among them and he's a Gentile. Now, if the law, the 10 words and the book of the covenant were carried out as God intended, there would never have been a middle wall of partition between Jew and Gentile. If I read my Bible correctly, you help me if I'm wrong, man erected that middle wall, not God. But God did away with it by removing the law. God never, I don't find anywhere with the law, the book of the covenant, God ever made that wall that separated Jew and Gentile. In fact, he said to the Jews, you be my witnesses to the Gentiles, so they'll leave idolatry and come serve me. That never could have happened if God had erected that middle wall that is referred to. So, this is where God put this. Now, you have a tremendous illustration of this in the book of Ruth. Best illustration of it that I could give you anywhere. Remember, in dealing with Ruth, you deal with a period of time. You deal with the period of the judges. And you're dealing with this third generation out of Egypt and into Canaan. When you deal with the period of the judges, you basically have Judges 1 and 2 as introductory material to the period. Then you have Judges 17 through 20 that deal with the immorality and idolatry that characterize the period of the judges. Then you have Ruth. That showed the incorruptibility of the remnant during the period of the judges. Then you have Judges 3 through 16, in which you deal with the individual judges. Now, this is the way I recommend you study the book. Study the period. And in my judgment, too often, see, we've just talked about judges. Well, very likely Ruth took place during the time of period just before Othniel began to serve as a judge, or during his reign. So you're moving on down. But it's my judgment that these two chapters will introduce the period. These chapters will show you the conditions that existed generally during the period. This chapter shows you the remnant that's trying to do right. And then these chapters will help you deal with the individual judges. So you look at that and see if that's a sensible approach to the period. Now, I'm not going to cover the book of Ruth tonight. But in chapters 2 to 4, you will remember that Boaz was such a good man that when Ruth met him and he found out her situation, he instructed his workers to pull out grain and leave it. Not only just let her go behind and pick up what fell, but provide for her. And then he provided for her. And then in chapter 4, he becomes that Goel, that Redeemer. When the nearest kinsman refuses to redeem her, then Boaz becomes the Goel, the Redeemer, the near kinsman Redeemer. And it is in chapter 4, the last paragraph of chapter 4, verses 13 to 22, that you have the bridge that takes you from Jacob to David. You move through Perez, you see that genealogy. Turn Matthew 1, you'll see a parallel. And it's in Ruth that you're introduced to David by means of genealogy. And all this comes about as a result of what we're reading tonight in the book of the Covenant. Now turn to the 31st chapter of the book of Job. Job 31, and if I'm right about the chronology of Job, he would live sometimes during either before or during the period of Abel. And very likely the book of Job, the first book chronologically of the Bible written. But in Job 31:16, Job said, "If I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat of it." Now notice you got the widow. Well, first you have the poor, you have the widow, you have the orphan. "But from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. I have seen anyone perish, if I've seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering. If his heart has not blessed me, that would be because I took care of him. And if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I raised my hand against the fatherless when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fail from my shoulder, let my arm be torn from the socket, for destruction from God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence I cannot endure." Now notice, a long time before the book of the Covenant, under patriarchy, Job was observing these same principles we're reading tonight. Remember, there are overarching principles that go from covenant to covenant to covenant. And taking care of the widows and the orphans particularly fall into that category. Once we get into the nation in Exodus and the contact with the Gentile nations particularly, then the sojourner comes in. Questions or comments? Turn to Psalms 146. And verse 9. "Jehovah watches over the strangers. He relieves the fatherless and widow." And one writer said, "An institution specially designed for the protection and relief of the poor was the second tithe, the so-called poor's tithe. The first tithe belonged to the Levites. What remained over was again tithed, and the produce of this second tithe, devoted in the first 2 years to a feast in the sanctuary and the offering of first fruits, was devoted in the 3rd year to a feast in the dwelling house, to which the Levites and the strangers, the widows and the orphans were invited." And this writer gives you Deuteronomy 14 and Deuteronomy 26. Now, this goes to help us in two areas. You have often heard it said that under the law, the Jews gave how much?
10%.
And some people, well-meaning, in preaching on giving for us, have said, the Jews gave 10%, we ought to at least give that much. The only thing wrong with that was, this is wrong.
They gave more.
I'm sorry?
They gave more.
Probably, if I've added it up correctly, they gave somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 1/3%. I'm all for us outgiving the Jews, aren't you? But let's don't latch on to something that's not true. What people have done is to have read about the tithe, but they don't read about the tithe of the tithe, or the third year tithe. They don't consider the free will offerings. And so there's a lot more involved than 10% in the Old Testament, under the law of Moses. And we need to know that. We're talking about giving. I'm giving 11%, therefore I'm better than the Jews. Well, we might ought to get our calculator back out. Now, God is as merciful, one writer said, to the weak and helpless, as severe towards the bold and stubborn evildoers. Look at Zechariah chapter 7. Zechariah chapter 7. Beginning verse 8. Then the word of Jehovah came to Zechariah, saying, Thus says Jehovah of hosts, execute true justice, show, we have mercy here. American Standard would have had loving kindness, that's chesed, and compassion, everyone to his brother. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless. And here you have the alien. All of you have alien there, King James folks? You have stranger there. Or the poor. Let none of you plan evil in his heart against his brother. So here you have the widow, the fatherless, and the Gentile. Now, Zechariah chronologically goes with what? Zechariah chronologically goes with what?
The last 6 books of Old Testament.
The what?
The last 6 books of Old Testament.
You take good notes.
Well, I wasn't really interested in that.
return from Babylonian captivity. And these are the last 6 books of the Old Testament, chronologically. So you have the return. Now it's interesting. What we're reading tonight, they're not even in Canaan yet. The book of the covenant. But what we just read in Zechariah, they not only have lived in Canaan, they've lost Canaan, and some of them have been restored to Canaan. But they're still, remember they went back, Ezra went back to restore the law. So they put the law, which would involve the 10 words in the book of the covenant, which brings this back in. Questions or comments? Did you say you had a question?
No, I said I really didn't understand the wording
Of how I was asking it? Chronologically belongs to the return from Babylon. And when you get into Canaan, you need to look at the nation. This is the way generally you'll see it on charts or in books. Pre-exile, exile, post-exile. Pre-exile from their conquering Canaan, Joshua, to Israel's being taken into Assyrian captivity, and then 135 years later, Judah being taken into Babylonian captivity. That's exile. So, pre-exile, exile, post-exile, their return from Babylon. That needs to be your 3-way overview of the nation in the land. Questions? Right, any questions on this treatment then of the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner? Anyone? Right, in verses 25 to 27, you have the law of lending and borrowing money. In verses 25 and 27, you have the principle of benevolence. They are to be benevolent toward their brethren. If, you don't have to, may never, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like, similarly, a money changer or money lender to him. You shall not charge what?
Interest.
All right? You don't act like a creditor. If you loan money, lend to a poor person, someone who's overwhelmed by his want, his lack, you don't act like a creditor to him. See, a creditor lends money based on what principle?
His return.
Making money off of the loan. So you are not to work that way. They are not to take any interest from the money loaned to their brethren. Go to Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25:35. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty, becomes poor and literally his hand fails, then you shall help him, like you would a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your Elohim, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. All right? It's not a money-making proposition. And the basis is, he's your brother. Go to Deuteronomy 23 for the new generation. 19 and 20. You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. To a foreigner, that's one not a sojourner, you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest, in order that Jehovah your God may bless you in all to which you set your hand in the land which you are entering to possess. Right? Notice, your prosperity in Canaan is tied to your benevolent attitude toward your brethren. Go to Psalms 15. Look at verse 5. Well, let's get the context. Go back to verse 1. Jehovah, who may abide, sojourn, dwell in your tabernacle, who may dwell in your holy hill. All right? You're the people that qualify to live with Jehovah. He who walks uprightly and works righteousness, and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear Jehovah. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change, he who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against him. Look at where being benevolent falls in dwelling with Jehovah. Go to Nehemiah. Chapter 5. Nehemiah chronologically falls where? In the return from Babylon. Y'all say it with me. In the return from Babylon. Didn't hurt you. You all made it. We didn't have a single entry, did we? Nehemiah 5 verse 7. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, each of you is, what do you have there? Nothing? Exacting? Exacting usury. Charging interest from his brother. So I called a great assembly against them. So look, when they came back from Babylon, they were forsaking this part of the law. And Nehemiah said, I called an assembly to set that straight. They were in violation of the book of the covenant. Questions or comments?
James, back to being benevolent to the stranger and all this. Where does this fall into, like on the street corner person
A straight corner person.
that's always asking for money?
No. Those people are leeches. And here's why. A man in this town recognized one of them as being a former schoolmate of his. This man who recognized him owned the business. He stopped, went back to the man, reminded him of their school days, and said, I want to give you a job. And the man said, how much will you pay? And when he was told, he said, I can't afford to take your job. I make more standing right here than I could make working for you. Those people are professional beggars. And that's why our city leaders put up a sign that said, if you're going to give through a reputable organization to help the real needy folks.
I have seen on TV where they made a living doing, it's
I have, when I drive by those folks who swap out, who work in shifts, I have no compunction at all about helping them. Now, when I see someone truly in need, I'll give them anything I can. And that's what's under consideration here.
and there's getting to be more and more of those.
Yeah, I know that, but that's not what's covered in this principle.
Right.
So, and every congregation with which I've worked has had people that make the circuit, the begging circuit. And when I was in Alabama, we had a man named Mr. Brown. He had an old brown suitcase he carried around with him. I stayed at one place 8.5 years. He came 3 times. What he was counting on was the preacher would be gone, they'd have another preacher, and they wouldn't know him. Because brethren don't keep up with all that. And he'd walk in and I said, well, Mr. Brown, you're back on your circuit back in Alabama this time. And we wouldn't help him. I moved to Georgia. He came up there one day. I said, Mr. Brown, you have moved to Georgia. When I was with the School of Preaching in Knoxville, I spoke one morning in Athens, Tennessee. Never been there in my life. Standing in the foyer between Bible study and worship, and in walks Mr. Brown. I said, well, Mr. Brown, you are now in your circuit in Tennessee. I said to those elders, don't help this man. He's a professional beggar. They ignored what I said and gave him money. And I promise you, you'll be back in 2 years, or would be back in 2 years. We had a woman came here 4 times. 3 times she got money. The 4th time, when she was told, we will not help you, she threatened to call our board and report our deacon, who was so heartless. And he didn't have any better sense than tell her how to spell his name. You see them when they come in. You know why they're there. When in fact she responded, she responds every time. When she sat down, I said, now Sherry, you've been here 3 times. No, I've never been here before in my life. So after services, I just went back to the study. I had written it down last time she was here, and I told our deacon she was here such and such a date. Don't help. I feel no compunction toward professional beggars, but really needy folks, yes, we are to help them. And sometimes they can be tricky, figuring out some cases. who really are. One place I lived when I worked in law enforcement, our house joined hard to the synagogue, and we had a fellow come one night to the house. So I said to him, I need to see your driver's license. And I said, do you have a warrant on you? No, sir. I said, now, I'll be up front with you. I'm going to run your driver's license. Do you have a warrant? No, sir. So I called the police department and I said, run this number. They did, had an outstanding warrant. They wanted to pick him up. So one of my fellow officers drove out to my house and arrested him. It was a long time after that before we had anybody else come by. The word gets around. You know, used to hobos would mark your house if you helped. And every hobo that came through would see that mark and they'd know you're somewhere against it. I'm off my soapbox now. So here's the benevolent principle. Now look at verse 27. Well, verse 26, if you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only coat. It is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. So do not charge interest. In verse 25, you have a switching between you, singular, and ye, King James, plural. The duty of not charging interest was individual, between individuals, and collectively as far as the nation was concerned, coming out of the treasury. Do not charge interest. Now, the graciousness, the mercy, the loving kindness of Jehovah guides this law. Jehovah expects his people to imitate him in their actions toward other people. If you go over to Exodus 34, beginning verse 5. Now Jehovah descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of Jehovah. Jehovah passed before him and proclaimed, Jehovah, Jehovah, the God merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Notice that description of Jehovah. Good, merciful, keeping mercy. That characteristic of Jehovah was to characterize his people. Now, if someone borrowed money and they gave you their coat that said, I'm going to leave your coat, my coat, as collateral. If they haven't been able to pay you at the end of the day, you give it back to them because that's what they cover with at night. His outer garment, worn for protection against the cold and the rain. It's a square cloak with unsewn spaces for armholes, composed of either 3 or 4 widths of woven stuff. The outer strips of the stuff, folded back and sewn at the upper edges, form shoulder straps. And the fact that a cloak was the only collateral the poor man could offer, if you mark in your notes, illustrates how poor he was. That's all he had. You've heard people say, all he has is the shirt on his back. Well, that's it. That's that right there. So each day before sundown, you return it. Go to Deuteronomy 24. Begin verse 10. Notice this. when you lend your brother anything, you shall not go into his house to get his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you lend shall bring the pledge out to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not keep his pledge overnight. You shall in any case return the pledge to him again when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in his own garment and bless you, and it shall be, look at it, righteousness to you before Jehovah your God. Remember in Philippians 4, Paul said, I want what abounds to your account. That's that principle right here. When you help people like you should, like Philippi was doing Paul, Paul said it's a deposit into your account, into your spiritual account with God. So you end up being blessed. Now Jehovah says, if you don't do this and the borrower cries unto me, then I will act on that. Go to Amos chapter 2. Begin in verse 6. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4. What hermeneutical device do we have here? For 3 transgressions of Israel, yea, for 4. Yeah, what I gave was X plus 1, but X would be the number 3. X plus 1, 4. So you're adding something to it. That's the principle. It's there for illustration, not to be literal. Because they sell the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. See, that's trading in their brethren. They pant after the dust of the earth, which is on the head of the poor, and pervert the way of the humble. A man and his father go into the same girl to defile my holy name. They lie down by every altar, look at it, on clothes taken in pledge, and drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. Well, that's Israel violating the book of the covenant. Questions or comments on borrowing and lending? In verse 28, we have the law against reviling. You shall not revile Elohim, nor curse a ruler of your people. The word revile means to make light of. Translated curse in 21:17. While Elohim has referred to the judges in previous places, it probably refers to Jehovah here. Don't make light of Jehovah. But notice this also. They must not curse a ruler of the people. Number 16 will deal particularly with this. And I give you a number of other Old Testament passages, but turn to Acts 23. Paul is before the Sanhedrin. Verse 30 of chapter 22. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Then, learn anything there? Don't click. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck, look at it, contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. All right, Paul knew this law, didn't he? Now, here's you something to chew on. Was Ananias a high priest at this point? No. Why? The law was taken away at Pentecost. So it's very likely that what Paul here says, in quoting the scripture, he says in irony, I didn't know he was the high priest. By implication, in reality, he's not a high priest as far as God's concerned. And you're judging me according to the law. If you knew the law, you would know you were not a high priest. Now you can chew on that and see if you think that's what he did or not. Turn to Romans 13. Now, we all have to be careful here. When you have whom you consider to be a nut in charge, you have to be careful with your attitude and what you say. Think about being in the Roman Empire when Caligula was Caesar. Caligula was a nut. If they had had mental health people in that day, he would have been what we would call a certified nut. He bestowed a consulship on his horse. He was a nut, but he was still Caesar. And while you know the man who is Caesar is a nut, you still respect the office. So in Romans 13, verses 1 to 7, Paul says that the government is a part of what God has given to carry out His rule of law. And His rule of law would provide for reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked, if it's carried out correctly. But we must remember the governing authorities, and we must be subject to them because they get their authority where? From God. What did Jesus tell Pilate? Pilate said, don't you know I have power to release you or power to put you to death? What did Jesus tell you?
You have no power on me at all except we're giving you from above.
You wouldn't have any power if God had given you. What does Daniel say? What did he tell Nebuchadnezzar about God and government?
God establishes the rulers according to His wisdom, His knowledge.
And he said to Nebuchadnezzar, you wouldn't be on the throne if God didn't allow you. In 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2, what's your first word there? Therefore, does that tell you anything? Huh? Yeah, don't click. Therefore, I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for some men. And that's all mankind there. Then he's specific, for kings and all who are in authority. A prominent place, that we may lead a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and reverence. We pray for our rulers. Sometimes we pray they'll be defeated in their evil. I'm convinced we get to heaven, that's what the first century church had to pray regarding Nero and every other Caesar that ruled. Bless our rulers, but defeat them in their evil. But we respect the office. Now that's hard when you have a nut in the office. But we still respect the office. 1 Peter 2. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God, honor all. Love the brotherhood, fear, respect God, honor the king. So that's the law against reviling a ruler. Now it's not wrong to say what the ruler did was wrong here. But it's wrong to make light of the authority of the office. I remember well when the speed limit on interstates was lowered to 55. Didn't you remember that? Because it would save energy, because gas was the whopping price of what? 75 cents a gallon? Reckon why somebody hadn't thought of that now.
How old are you?
One of those things from his age.
About 68.
I respect the office. Now, I didn't like it, but I obeyed. I remember when seatbelt law was passed. I didn't like it, but I obeyed it. I remember when child seat law was passed. I didn't like it, but we put our children in whatever was supposed to be for them at that time. Looking back, if we'd had a wreck, it'd killed them, because those things weren't any more safe than letting them walk around the floorboard, which they had done previously to that law being passed. Are you with me? We may not like the law, we may not like the person in the office, but we respect the authority of the office. As long as you finish it.
The law doesn't conflict with God's
The
law.
law that's passed doesn't conflict with God's law. At that point, Acts 5, we obey God rather than man. Let's take 10. Leviticus in Exodus 22, 29, and 30, we have the law concerning first fruits. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. One writer said the whole system of sacrifice was a joyful and grateful acknowledgement that God had created a livable and bountiful life for His people. These sacrifices were a statement of faith, expressed in practical and physical ways. Notice they are to give promptly of their first fruits. They are not to delay in any way. And they are to give as they prosper. Out of their harvest, their crops, the overflowing of their grapes and their olives. Go to Proverbs chapter 3. Look at Solomon's proverb. Verses 9 and 10. Honor Jehovah with your possessions, and with the first fruits of all your increase. Now look at it. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will what?
Burst.
We serve a God who gives leftovers. Shall overflow, will overflow, with new wine. New wine's grape juice. So you're treading out the grapes, and you have so many, your vat won't hold the grape juice. It's just flowing over. So notice two things. Promptly they are to give, and they're to give as they prosper. So when we get to the new covenant, giving as we prosper is not a new concept.
And doesn't it say in the New Testament that one of the reasons we're supposed to work is to be able to help our brother?
Be able to what?
Help our brother?
Yeah, Ephesians 4. Is it 28? Check me out. Let him that stole steal no more, but let him labor with his hands, in order that he might have to give to him who has need. 28 doesn't sound right.
It is right.
26, huh?
28 is right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's see if we've heard it.
Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the things which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth.
Wish I'd said that. So yes, that's
Very
the
good.
principle by which we operate. So look at the background. There's so much, see, that we learn in principle in the Old Testament that we get the New Testament is not new. It's been there. And you have these Jews and Gentiles who have been under the law, who obey the gospel. They don't have to change a lot of their already knowledge as far as principle is concerned. They have to bring it in compliance with the covenant under which they live. But the principle is there. And you see that, and that really helps you to understand that. Notice the firstborn are to be given to Jehovah. Now let's go back to Exodus 13. They're coming out of Egypt. Look at verse 2. Do you all have consecrate? Everybody have consecrate there? Sanctify, all right? You may have a marginal note, set apart. That's what sanctify, consecrate means. To me, A-double-L, all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. Drop down verse 11. And it shall be when Jehovah brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you. Then you shall, do you have here set apart? Set apart to Jehovah all that open the womb, that is, every firstborn that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be Jehovah's. So you have this principle of giving the firstborn. The firstborn of the sheep and of the oxen are to be given. 7 days the animal remains with its mother, and then on the 8th day, now that's interesting, 8th day, that figures prominently with a male child. The 8th day, same day males are to be circumcised, this animal is to be given to Jehovah. Now, according to Numbers 18, there were some firstborn that were to be redeemed. Numbers 18, verse 15. Everything that first opens the womb of all flesh, which they bring to Jehovah, whether man or beast, shall be yours. Right? He's talking about the support of the priests. Nevertheless, the firstborn of man you shall surely redeem, and the firstborn of unclean animals you shall redeem. Right? So some firstborn are to be redeemed, and those redeemed of the devoted things you shall redeem when 1 month old, according to your valuation, for 5 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, which is 20 gerahs. But the firstborn of a cow, the firstborn of a sheep, or the firstborn of a goat, you shall not redeem. They are holy, that is, set apart. You shall sprinkle their blood on the altar and burn their fat as an offering made by fire for a sweet aroma to Jehovah. So there are some animals, some firstborn you don't give to Jehovah, you redeem. You buy back, you buy out for the price that is set. But the principle, firstborn, given to Jehovah, which you wouldn't you think generally carries with it the idea of the best goes to Jehovah first, and then you enjoy the rest. Questions or comments?
James,
Yeah.
how are that includes human males, right? How are they to be given to the Lord?
Why?
How?
Oh, how? Dedicated to His service in some way. Unless it specifies, we're not told exactly.
Like Samuel?
Well, I may be wrong, Ellen, but it seems to me there's a difference in this firstborn given and the Nazarite. And Samuel seems to have been a Nazarite, which was a different setting apart. It may have been that they were to be helpers of the Levites around the tabernacle or the temple. But I'm guessing. I don't remember off the top of my head, do you, a passage that specifies how they are
That's why
set
it's
apart? I will look into that even more. If I find it next week, I'll bring it up. That's a great question. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else?
But it said they were set apart for the Lord, but they could be redeemed.
They could be bought out and used normally.
Right, okay.
And some, when they were bought out, were to be sacrificed. Okay, anyone else? Very good. All right, in verse 31, you have the law against eating the flesh of animals killed by other animals. And you shall be what?
Holy.
Do you have holy men? Holy mankind. You shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Notice, number one, the position they are to occupy. Holy. Back in chapter 19, this was stressed. I give you the passages. It's stressed in 1 Peter 1:15. You shall be holy as I'm holy. 1 Peter 2:9, you are a holy people for Jehovah's possession. Now notice this quote. Mere outward services could neither please Him nor profit them. For from the very beginning of the world, the end of the commandment was love out of a pure heart and good conscience and faith unpretentious, unfeigned. 1 Timothy 1, verse 5. So this is not just a ceremony. If you're not careful, you will buy into the position taught that the law was merely ceremony. Well, if it were merely ceremony, God didn't accept it. Only that which came from the heart was accepted by God, which made it more than ceremony. And the problem with national Israel was, to them, mere ceremony was to win favor with God. God should have been pleased with their tithing out, mint, anise, cumin. And Jesus said, you ought to do that, yes, the law commands it. But you've also left undone the weightier matters of the law that have to deal with justice, mercy, love. Well, that's emotion. Some of that love is coming from the heart. Mercy. So it's not just ceremonial. When they kept the law only ceremonially, it didn't mean a thing to Jehovah. But they thought they could earn their way to glory by doing it ceremonially. So that was a part of when Jesus told a funny. That a lot of people don't know is a funny. You strain out the gnat and swallow the camel. That's hyperbole. They're so meticulous to strain out gnat larvae out of their water so they're not drinking an unclean animal. But if they saw a camel and they were hungry, they'd eat the camel. And that's an unclean animal. So as long as they kept a ceremony going. Then the precaution they do observe. Do not eat any flesh. How much? That is torn of beasts in the field. What are you to do with it? You won't make it myself in trouble. Flesh that is torn of beast is to be given to the dogs because the blood would not have been properly drained. Dogs were scavengers. The references to dogs eating one was a statement of derision. So I give you the passages. You remember of Jezebel for in particular? The dog shall drink up the blood of Jezebel. Well, that was a derisive statement. You're going to die an ignominious death. Now, mark little c. This precaution would separate Israel from the nations and show them to be Jehovah's peculiar people. Because Gentiles had no compunction about eating meat that had been killed by another animal. The blood not drained. So this sets them apart. Questions or comments? In chapter 23, the first 3 verses, we have laws concerning judicial matters. And this would also tie in with Exodus 20:16 of the 10 words. Don't bear false witness. These words, these verses, are in the apodictic, the law form of the 10 words. There are 5 brief negative commands, each introduced by a negative particle in Hebrew. These would be, mark it, guidelines in maintaining justice in the courts. Exodus 18 is where Jethro advised Moses to set up a court system, which used men to hear these cases. You shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. So bearing false witness is to be prevented. There are some personal motivations, at least two, that could cause them to bear false witness. Number one, personal profit. They were not to spread, to circulate a false, empty report, a rumor, and tell it for the truth. So don't be a false witness. Exodus 20, verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. An empty report reported to be truth. Now that's called slander. And concerning slander, Fields used this verse to state 3 points. Don't start it. Don't listen to it. Don't repeat it. Now stop. Put the same thing with gossip, with rumor. Don't start it. Don't you tell it. If somebody comes to tell you, don't listen to it. And if you hear it, don't tell anybody else. That stops it. So when somebody talks to you about somebody else, just say, stop. I'm not going to listen. I will go with you to that person and see if it can be straightened out. If you need me to do that, don't tell me. I'm not going to do it. You tell them. Then you could be persuaded publicly to be a false witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. Don't join the wicked, the morally wrong people, being an unrighteous witness. So they were not to join these Rashal, these morally wrong people. Look at Psalms 35. Look at verse 11. Fierce witnesses rise up, they ask the things that I do not know. The word unrighteous is from the Hebrew word kalmos. This noun and verb are together used 67 times. Mostly translators seem satisfied with the word violence in some form. This writer said, it may be noted, however, that the word kalmos in the Old Testament is used almost always in connection with sinful language. So don't join in with this kind of thing. An unrighteous witness is a witness of violence, that is, one who inflicts violence upon others. Now, violence need not always be physical to be terribly hurtful. You can inflict violence on someone by lying about them, slandering them. So don't do it. And especially in the court system is what's under consideration here. Don't join a majority to do evil, pervert justice. One writer said, in judging a cause, if you're one of the judges, don't simply go with the majority if it's bent on injustice. Form your own opinion and adhere to it. This would particularly apply in our day to serving on a jury. Don't just go with the majority because that's what they think. You do your own thinking. And a trial could end with a hung jury because one juror says, I'm not convinced. I'm not going to bend. Not going to give in because I'm not convinced that's what the evidence says. Not in a court of law, but in other things. I've been that one that irritated everybody else because I wasn't convinced. And I would not vote with the majority. One writer said, there is an infectiousness in the example of a crowd which only a firm backbone of principle and some independence of mind will enable us to resist. The tendency is to follow the multitude when it is to do evil. Men like to be on the side that is popular. They dread the reproach of singularity. They don't want to be singled out. There are those who would almost rather die than be out of the fashion. A crowd can ridicule and a crowd can intimidate. It may put pressure upon us, which we have not the moral courage to resist. A thing, besides, does not look so evil when many are engaged in doing it. They do not, of course, call it evil. They put new names upon it and laugh at us for our scruples. This may lead us to think that the course in which we're asked to join is not so very bad after all. So we belie or dissemble, that sounds like Galatians 2. Even Barnabas was carried away with their dissimulation, King James. We belie or dissemble our real convictions and do what the crowd bids us. To such influences, we're certain to fall a prey if we are governed by the fear of men more than by the fear of God. That's what the Sanhedrin was counting on with the apostles in Acts 4, 19 and 20. When they beat them, put them in prison, and said, don't you go down to the temple and preach anymore. They were counting on them to be afraid of men. And they said, we can but speak the things we've seen and heard. Or if we seek the praise of man more than the honor which comes from God. In John 12:43 particularly, many of the rulers of the synagogues believed on Jesus but wouldn't confess Him, lest they be put out of the synagogues, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. So, under the law system, be your own person. Do your own thinking. Turn to Acts 20. Acts 19, I'm sorry. In Ephesus, in Acts 19, verse 23. Verse 23. And about that time there arose a great commotion, no small contention. I believe the King James says there, or the American Standard. No small is a literary device for saying a big one. A great commotion about the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation, these are the trade guilds, and said, men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. Demetrius said, you folks know this Paul is taking money out of your pockets, not only here, but almost all over Asia. Profit. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, we're going to lose our jobs, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised, and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. How many of you have been to the Parthenon in Nashville? Remember the idol? That image is 90 feet tall. Now that's how tall the image was that Nebuchadnezzar made in Daniel 3. To which Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah would not fall down. So if you've not been, you get to go, or if it's been a long time and you don't remember, go back and look at that image just to see how big Nebuchadnezzar was. But to see, this is Diana. That's not to say that the image there was always that big, but the one in Nashville is. Now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Now notice, so the whole city was filled with what? Confusion. There's just a bunch of noise going on. And rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. And when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. Then some of the officials, you have Asiarchs, I believe, there, King James, is that right?
Chief of Asia.
Okay, the chiefs of Asia, literally Asiarchs, who were his friends, sent to him, pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Now look at 32. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another. They are not all saying the same thing. For the assembly was confused. Now, here's a statement you need to let sink in. And most of them did not know why they had come together. Now that's mob reaction. Mob reaction. We saw it in our nation's capital. There wasn't a thing in the world but a few people stirring up confusion. And I guarantee you there were a lot of folks got caught up in that had no intention of doing what they did when they went up there. Don't run with a mob. And that's what Moses, God, is saying here about the court system. So you stand your ground. Among the Jews, the junior upon the bench voted first, not to be swayed nor overruled by the authority of the senior. That's a good rule. Because a lot of times a young man in an office or on a jury is liable to be swayed by the older people thinking, well, they know more about this than I do. Not always. Sometimes your older folks can make some dumb decisions. I are one, so I know that by experience. So think it through. That's what he's saying. Look at the evidence. Judge on the evidence. What is being said or what is being presented. Questions or comments? You shall not, verse 3, show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. So don't give a good verdict to a poor man just because he's poor. We have a tendency to be more lenient toward somebody who's in bad circumstances. Moses said, look at the evidence. He's a poor man and he violated the law. Judge him as a violator of the law. Don't give him a break just because he's poor. Questions or comments? Verses 4 and 5, laws concerning the property of enemies. Now, in the context here, this may refer to an opponent in a court case. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. So here, these verses are in the specific form of case law. If it is the case, here's what you do. So you see your enemy's donkey going astray, that's his beast of burden. You bring that donkey back. And the word surely there is emphatic, in the emphatic position in the Hebrew, which means surely, without a doubt, you bring it back. Rather than saying, hey, serves him right, he won't have your donkey, he has to carry it himself. Or if you see the donkey lying under a burden, not able to get up, you go help your enemy get his donkey. Questions or comments? See, the law provided for protection of the interest of enemies. Do you see the background for agapao your enemies? Agapao, the widest form of love, wish their best, work in their best interests. You don't like what they do. You don't like how they live. You don't like the fact they're trying to hurt you. But you do not intentionally do them harm. That gets rid of that retaliation business. Number 5, one writer said, if a man wrongs us, it does not cancel that wrong to do him wrong in return. It is often those who are most unyielding in the matter of right, who are also most tender and assiduous in the matter of compassion. Sometimes you folks who stand the strongest for right are also the most compassionate. Sometimes people get the impression if you stand strong for right, you don't have any compassion on you. Questions or comments? All right, he's dealt with the jury. Now he addresses the judging, verses 6 to 9. 4 precepts. Again, this is in the case law form of the 10 words. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Don't warp justice, in other words. Your poor stresses the responsibility of the nation to see that justice is done to the poor in the court system. Now you're back to take care of the poor. And one of the ways, you see, if you're not careful, you'll tunnel vision in, take care of the poor, provide for their physical needs. Here is, take care of the poor, provide for their judicial needs, make sure they're treated fairly in the court system. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Look at it. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. Use caution in capital punishment. Now, he didn't say don't use capital punishment. He said use caution. Be sure you're not involved in a false matter. Do not pervert justice so that the innocent and righteous are slain. Look at Deuteronomy 27:25. Cursed is the one who takes a bribe to slay an innocent person. Now, if you do this, Jehovah will not justify. He will not cause you to be pronounced just. That's a word that carries with it the court system setting. You will not be pronounced just by God as the judge. And the word wicked here is singular, emphasizing every individual's responsibility in this matter. So don't twist justice. Use caution in capital punishment. Verse 8, you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. And I gave you bunch of references on don't take bribes. Tools of perverting justice are used by people who are doing wrong, and bribery is one of them. People operate, do they not, by every person has his price. That's not true of a Christian. We cannot be bought. Bribes blind. Put a film over your eyes. This may refer to your judgment being clouded like a cataract, clouds over the eyes. So bribes are tools of those who pervert justice. Bribes blind, and bribes pervert, subvert the cause of the righteous. One writer said, the words of the righteous seem to be the words of usually righteous judges who have been influenced by bribes. It may also refer to the causes or lawsuits of the poor, who are referred to as the righteous or innocent in verse 7. Questions or comments about Judges? I'm moving on over this. To me it's self-evident, but if it's not to you, interrupt me. Verse 8, you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Verse 9, also you shall not oppress a stranger, a sojourner, in a court case. For you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the lands of Egypt. So you know the nephesh. It's the word heart there. The feelings of a sojourner. Their experiences, or their experience in Egypt, was not only to convince them of the sovereignty of Jehovah, mark it, but also to prepare them to deal with their fellow man. The implication seems to be, you know how it feels for your cause not to receive due justice in the court system. Because that's how you were treated in Egypt. The judge who gives dishonest decisions betrays the cause of righteousness. He misrepresents the mind of God. He inflicts irremediable injury on the innocent. He opens a floodgate to iniquity. That's a good quote there. So here's your court system. Be fair and equitable in your court system. Remember Micah 6? God requires you to do justice. And Micah 6 is a courtroom scene. Jehovah bringing Israel into court. And a part of what does Jehovah require of you? Do justice. God is just with Israel in the courtroom. You be just with people in your dealings with them in the court system and in everyday life. All right, questions or comments on this part of the book of the covenant? Anyone? Well, we will drive a peg down here, and Lord willing, next Tuesday night.